While health and illness and curing the sick are important in all societies, they are understood and practiced differently in different cultural contexts. In fact, anthropologists ask questions that include the following. How does a particular culture and society define being well and being sick? In other words, what worldviews shape ideas of the body, of health, and of illness? How do people in particular societies seek to maintain their good health? How do they heal the people who are sick? And who is a doctor, an expert, or a health specialist in a particular society? And what do they do? Medical anthropology is a subfield of the discipline. It researches healthcare systems and ways of healing, different understanding of illness, and some of the social and cultural factors that affect well-being. As Henninger Reger writes in the book Perspectives, an open introduction to cultural anthropology, using cultural relativism and a comparative approach, medical anthropologists seek to understand how ideas about health, illness, and the body are products of particular social and cultural contexts. Something to keep in mind when thinking of the questions that we had earlier is that in many, if not in most societies, there are different perspectives or approaches to health and illness coexisting and often being used side by side. For example, in our society, the biomedical system of doctors, hospitals, and prescription drugs is a central way in which we respond to sickness. But look at this list for just a moment. Have you tried or used at least one of these other health approaches? Perhaps you have used essential oils or had acupuncture, just like this dog, or you took some naturopathic medicine or some herbal teas. I, for example, have acupuncture from time to time, use a herbal medicine when I do not sleep very well, and go see my doctor for routine blood tests. In some societies, people might go see a traditional healer, a shaman, or a herbalist, and also go see a biomedical doctor or visit a clinic, and sometimes of the same diseases. Another very interesting question and important consideration for medical anthropologists regards the dramatic inequalities when it comes to health, and that is something that medical anthropologists study, that is at the center of their considerations. And when I say dramatic inequalities, I mean how some people and groups have access to very good quality healthcare, while others have almost no way to obtain even basic medicine and healthcare. An example of this is malaria, which disproportionately affects poorer people in the world. To understand malaria, its causes and effects, there are many aspects that need to be taken into account. Kenyon Smedley mentioned some of them, such as the access to prevention and cure for malaria, local understanding of a sickness, global economic disparities, as well as particular contexts of villages and communities, where people live, the work that they do, and how they are connected to resources. Researching these aspects are important because it can help to develop more effective responses and approaches. So let's briefly look at some of these aspects. Kenyon Smedley explained that millions of people in the world today are at risk of malaria, and the disease particularly affects people living in poorer countries and has a terrible toll on children's lives. Recognizing the disease early and getting access to medicine is very important. Another very important aspect of malaria is prevention, for example, by using mosquito nets. However, what is also necessary, according to Kenyon Smedley, are studies on the actual context of malaria, how people access care, what is the history of the sickness in a particular community, and how the disease is understood. They describe the work of anthropologist Vanay Kamat, who researched malaria in a village in Tanzania. When doing research, Kamat learned that there is a sickness called degedege that many people do not recognize as malaria, but is indeed a kind of cerebral malaria. It is a form that affects particularly children, and it is fatal unless it is treated quite early. This is a quote from Kamat and her work of 2009, cited in Kelly and Smedley 2017 on page 148. Kamat writes, the Kiswahili word degedege literally translates into English as bird. In coastal Tanzania, among the Zaramo people in particular, the illness is believed to be caused by a coastal spirit that takes the form of a bird that casts its shadow on vulnerable children on moonlight nights. Children who come under the bird's shadow subsequently become seriously ill, develop convulsion, and in many cases succumb to the illness and die. While most mothers I interviewed shared the cultural understandings of the etiology of degedege, there was considerable variation and flexibility in how they interpreted the taxonomy of fevers and the trajectory of the illness or the ultimate cause of the illness. In Mwande, that's a village where Kamat did research, people consider bad luck or God's will to render particular children to be more vulnerable than others to degedege. Thus, when asked why some children are more prone to contracting degedege than others, the majority of the people in the village responded that it was just God's wish or God's work, and that it was due to witchcraft, sorcery, or someone's evil actions. This belief significantly influences their acceptance of the fatal outcomes of the illness. Interviews with key informants and with local people who are known for their expertise in diagnosing and treating cases of degedege suggested that there is a general agreement that the illness is caused by a spirit bird. So the situation with malaria is quite complicated because local understanding of the illness, as Kamat describes, are very important. Kamat's work, however, did not stop there. He did not just look at understanding of the illness. He also looked at the social and economic context of healthcare in the region. People living in the village where he did research, for example, were relocated from another town. This was accompanied by an influx of migrants from northern Tanzania, and there was, as a result, a shortage of land. Kamat's research included how people had to travel far to reach a municipal pharmacy, and how there were few nurses and health clinics available. Many people, and especially children, die in this village because they do not get access to medicine. So focusing only on how people interpret and understand an illness is not enough, because even if they see that their children are getting malaria, they cannot necessarily access the medicine that are required to treat it. The lack of resources of the health system also impacts how people involved in public health can reach people in a health campaign and can have conversations with them about the symptoms of diseases and accessing medicine. In turn, Cavach's research also suggests health programs have to take into consideration local understanding of illness, how people know that they are unwell, and what they think they need to do to heal. Cavach says that even if all medicine against malaria were available in the town, parents might still not give them to children or bring children to the clinic because they think it has nothing to do with malaria. This example shows that anthropological studies of health and illness and research on health disparities need to take into consideration a multitude of factors. Another example of health disparities is Hamdi's research, which we'll read about next week. Hamdi writes about how people suffering from kidney diseases in Egypt receive dialysis from very old machines. Hamdi describes this situation as when both your kidneys and the state fails you. One of the things that she shows is that people with the same disease in different countries might have access to very different care. Health inequalities, moreover, occur not just between societies, but also within the same society. In Italy, for example, there is free healthcare available to all regular residents and citizens. People can go to hospitals and to practitioners for free. However, those who can afford it still prefer to pay out of pocket to bypass the long lines and go see the best specialist, rather than just the general ones that are provided by the free healthcare. On the other extreme, during my fieldwork in Milan, in Italy, I had many conversations with volunteer doctors and medical groups who go around in the evenings to visit undocumented migrants living in abandoned factory buildings in the periphery of the city because they have no access to healthcare otherwise. Another important thing to consider when researching health and illness from an anthropological perspective is the main system that we are used to, biomedicine. Here in Canada, as well as in the United States, biomedicine is the main dominant approach to health and medicine. As Henniger Reger write, we think of illness as having a particular cause, a specific cause that we can find out. This can include viruses, bacteria, biochemical malfunction in our body, conditions, or particular disorders, for example, an organ failure. And it is interesting, Henniger Reiner points out that biomedicine we are used to sees being well as not having a sickness, so to speak, a lack of disease. A perspective, she says, that notably excludes consideration of social or spiritual well-being. And this is Henniger Reger from the book Culture: An Open Introduction to Cultural Anthropology. For this reason, she writes, in non-Western contexts, biomedical explanations are often viewed as unsatisfactory. Biomedicine also sees the body as a machine and, in fact, often use metaphors referring to warfare to talk about combating germs or winning a battle about cancer. So if we start thinking about it, it's interesting to examine, to investigate the very particular ideas that are part of the biomedical system and the biomedical approach to health that we are used to. And anthropologists like to do that, to think of this approach that we are so used to, because one of the key ideas that they want to discuss is that biomedicine is based on a particular system of knowledge and as such is a cultural product. So this idea that biomedicine itself is a cultural product might seem strange to you at first, because the very definition of science and medicine is that it is a universal approach to the body and it has nothing to do with culture, as it is supposed to be objective and based on the pure facts of nature. However, the very way we think of objectivity, the way we think of science and facts, understand the body, are necessarily shaped by our historical cultural developments. For example, Kenny and Smiley explained that the biomedical paradigm of the body is shaped in very important ways by the Cartesian dualism that separates mind and body into two different entities. Kenny and Smiley explained that this separation of mind and body can be traced back to the 17th century, and its idea that the body is a sort of machine with very different parts working together. This idea is certainly different, for example, from the one of the Tzinacanteco people in Mexico. Kenny and Smiley write that Tzinacanteco people think that the soul contains 13 parts that can go missing, producing illness. In order to heal a person, special rituals help to regain a missing part of one's soul. The biomedical idea of the body is also very different from the idea of the body of the Wari that we talked about earlier, in which a body is not a finite, bounded entity, but is continuously made and remade, fabricated, as Vilaja says, in interactions with others, including living and eating together. We talked about this when we talked about kinship. But here I want you to think that it is also a different idea of the body, and so a different idea of well-being as well. Looking at different understanding of the body then help us see that biomedicine is, like all systems of knowledge, a result of the culture, and it is shaped by the particular place and time and history in which it emerged, in which it is produced. Anthropologists then are interested in understanding how the medicine, the system of medicine that we are so used to and rely on, is actually just one of many ways of understanding the body, illness, healing, and health. This week, you are reading the first part of Lisa. Just like Gilbert and Kurtovich, the authors of Lisa, Hamdi and Nie, decided that a graphic novel might be a very good way to portray a complex social issue and to show an anthropological perspective or how anthropologists think about a certain topic. Lisa is a collaboration between two medical anthropologists, Shireen Hamdi, that you see on the left side, and Coleman Mie, who you see on the right side. They are doing research in two different areas in two different countries, which makes their collaboration in the book very interesting and quite special. Hamdi has been studying health and illness in Egypt, and in particular, the social context of kidney disease. Coleman Mie researches cancer in the US and the genetic risks for cancer. Based on these two fields of research, Lisa follows two characters who are facing two different health issues, breast cancer and kidney disease, across two different countries. The aim of the book is to raise questions about the social context of disease and of medicine, or as Hamdi describes so well on page 266, the social embeddedness of the patient. And these images in the graphic novel, I think, show really well this idea of social embeddedness. The question is how our understanding of particular illness is shaped by culture and society. How are individual patients part of the social web, these connections that you will see in the novel? How are patients' health decisions shaped by where they live, their life circumstances, and the complex connections between individual bodies, their environments, and social forces? As Shireen Hamdi says on page 264, this graphic novel, Lisa, investigates how social contexts shape medical decision in very different sites. And in this book, the sites are Egypt as well as the US. So when you read a book, pay attention to how Hamdi and Mie use a graphic novel format to show illness in a social context. How does the graphic ethnography depict connection between different characters? And even here in this picture, you can start thinking of the connections between the characters. How do they represent social realities, worldviews, social conflicts, and even categories like class, race, and gender? Lisa looks critically at the biomedical model of health and illness that we talked about earlier this week. On page 266, Hamdi points out that doctors usually looked at the individual body. This is what they're trained to do as doctors. However, what Lisa is interested in is how individual health issues, and especially individual health decisions, are deeply connected to the people who are around the patient. As you will see when reading Lisa, sometimes people decide to have a medical intervention because of their experiences caring for sick people in their families or in their communities. Undergoing a medical treatment could perhaps mean that others around them will not have to suffer or care for a loved person close by. At other times, however, the opposite might be true. Not undergoing medical treatment can be a way to spare others difficult consequences, perhaps their medical expenses, care, or even undergoing surgery themselves in the case of a family member donating an organ to others. One of the interesting things about Lisa is that it is fictionalized. This is a strategy that is used by several anthropologists, so I want to briefly explain it here. The main characters in the book are what we could call fictive characters. They were created in order to tell a story in the graphic novel. And here you see two of the main characters. However, when anthropologists do that, the characters are not simply made up. They are real in the sense that they show and embody the lives, social situations, and dilemmas that many real research participants encounter or have encountered. In other words, the characters that Mie and Hamdi have created, and that you can see here, are based on years of fieldwork and research interviews. They combine some of the life stories, the difficult decisions, and real health circumstances of the many people they have talked to. In the appendix to the book that I invite you to read this week or next week when you finish reading Lisa, Shireen Hamdi explains how the character of Anna was created. Anna is based on the case of a young woman who Mie met in her research in the Netherlands with the pseudonym of Anita. Hamdi explains that Anita's mother died of breast cancer when Anita was little. As a result, Anita had to face many difficult health decisions as an adult, including whether to do genetic testing to find out her breast cancer risks and whether to undergo surgery. Similarly, Hamdi's research encounters with kidney patients in Egypt shaped characters in Lisa and some of their health decisions around dialysis and kidney transplant. As we discussed earlier in the course, the advantage of fieldwork and of an anthropological perspective is to understand the complexities in people's lives and how individual decisions are connected to social contexts, including people's worldview, their economic situation, and social position. In Lisa, even the political situation of one's country. So using fictionalized character is an interesting strategy to show how this complexity can play out in a person's life.